welcome everybody to episode number 4 of course number 1 of School of SuperAdobe, which focuses entirely on how to build a SuperAdobe dome. Now, we dove really deeply into soils in episode number 3, and this episode is a direct extension of everything that we learnt there. So as always, these episodes are meant to be watched in order. So if you haven't started at number 1 yet, please head back and give them all a really thorough watch so you know exactly what's going on. In the last episode, we discussed topsoils and subsoils and what constitutes different soils from all over the globe and what all of that means. So we shared about rock, sand, and clay making up most subsoils from all over the world. Now, it's from these 3 ingredients that we're now going to dive into creating the best mix to go inside our SuperAdobe bags to create strong, resistant, and easy to fill layers on your dome or SuperAdobe project. The best mixture ratio I have come across in my travels is an even amount of clay, sand, and gravel. So specifically, this is approximately 33% gravel, 33% sand, and 33% clay, or 1 to 1 to 1 as a ratio. This is often sold as road-based, but using retail-based names is a really unreliable practice, as the names of things will change dramatically all over the world, and even from one yard to another local yard. So it's best to discuss its purpose and use rather than its name. These are just names given to materials at sand and soil merchants or quarries, and everyone I've ever been to uses different names. I've also had huge success with around 20% clay and 80% coarse sand. This gives an incredibly smooth and easy to work with mixture which fills the bags incredibly smoothly. The CalEarth campus, they have mainly coarse and fine sand with a tiny 5% or less clay. So anything ranging from 5% to 35% clay, and the rest of the mix is sand and gravel, is acceptable to work with in my experience. But I want to teach you the absolute ideal here. This is specifically discussing an unstabilized mix, which can be built with successfully without the use of cement or lime as an added stabilizer, curer, and binding agent. The clay in this scenario is enough to hold the bags together. This is a method that I've worked with extensively in my building career, but it isn't suggested for the beginner builder like yourself for a couple of reasons. You must be first proficient and effective at these main tasks within dome building: getting the perfect moisture content in your mix, filling and laying your bags very evenly, tamping to adequate compression, and compassing within ½ an inch of accuracy. All of these things, they're really hard to get perfect on your first dome build. So using a stabilizer for the entire dome is really highly recommended. It will let the layers below the one you're working on set up in just a matter of hours, and it makes sure that everything is really locked in before moving on to the next layer. The only thing which should make you not work with a stabilizer is the availability of materials or your budget. Here is an example of our emergency individual sandbag shelter that we built at CalEarth in just 3.5 hours with about 15 people, and also our SuperAdobe Apprentice Dome, and they both contain no stabilizer whatsoever in the mix. The mix was perfectly wetted, and we were being taught by master instructors. That is why these buildings were both major successes. The chance of failure, especially around the openings once you pull the forms out, is really high and not recommended for the beginner builder. As a rule, while I do build with unstabilized mix, is to stabilize any part of the bags which are coming into contact with the opening forms, so that I build a surrounding stabilized section around all of the openings. I also do completely stabilized foundational rows, and every 3rd or 4th row going up, and then the complete top third of the dome. But we'll get more into this later in the course when we get into bag laying. You must also have more than enough clay in your mix if you are going to use no stabilizer, so that the clay holds everything in the bags together very well and can dry and bind the entire mix together thoroughly. I would never recommend a high sand and rock mix with 10% or less clay if building with no stabilizer. the bags just would not have enough clay to hold themselves together safely while building and drying, especially for a beginner before your eye and your body is tuned enough to notice all the small nuances which can compound to complete building failure. If you are using a stabilizer, we often discuss it as an admix amount, which means that we're adding a certain amount of cement or lime to the mix at the end, which is often equivalent to between 5 to 10% of the overall beginning mixture. Anything above 10% is often not needed unless your clay content is incredibly low, like below 3% in your overall mix. It's best to keep your clay percentages to at or under that 33% as a general rule. I have built with 100% clay, but it's strongly not advised as it can become really dangerous while building, as I mentioned before, and will stay highly volatile and susceptible to water penetration and expansion of the bags, or worst case, structural failure during heavy rain. So it's definitely not advised to build with 100% clay in your bags. I only did this as a very uneducated beginner. So as an example, if from your two previous tests from the last episode, your hand test and your jar test, you believe that you have around 60% clay and 40% coarse and fine sand in your subsoil mix, we want to move closer towards that 20 to 30% clay content for ideal bags. First, we will convert our percentages into parts so that it's simpler to visualize, but also so we get really proficient at that conversion, as we're going to be doing it a lot on site. Now, be warned, this is going to get really mathy, but please don't tune out. I'm not your boring high school maths teacher. This is fun. We're building earthbag buildings, okay? First, we find the highest common factor between the two percentages, 60% and 40%, or in other words, the highest number which can fit into both of these numbers without creating a decimal or a fraction. Some factors for these two numbers, 60 and 40, are 1, 2, 5, and 10, because they all fit into both numbers. So we're going to take 10 as it's our highest factor. Now, divide both by this factor of 10. 60 divided by 10 equals 6, and 40 divided by 10 equals 4. So therefore, we're left with a ratio of 6 to 4. This is how we would talk about this mix on site. 6 parts clay, 4 parts sand. Now, this one was easy as it was just basically removing the zeros from the percentages, but it's not always that simple. So we're going to be doing some harder ones a little bit later. A ratio is a collection of numbers divided by semicolons, which represents a specific division of a whole. Or in other words, it's a laying out of amounts of separate parts which make up a whole. In this instance, the whole is our completed mix ready to go in our bags. So let's add some gravel to our mix. As we know from my previous example of road base being a really successful mix, the gravel and clay portions of that mix were equal. So let's first aim for adding an equal amount of gravel as clay to our mix. Currently, there are 6 parts of clay, so we're going to add 6 parts of gravel, equaling 6 gravel, 6 clay, and 4 sand. But we must keep track of which parts are actually made up of 100% subsoil while we're doing these equations. So our 6 parts clay, 4 parts sand are actually 10 parts of site soil. It's important to keep this in mind so that we know how to make our final mix when on site. Now let's convert our new mix back to a percentage. Again, this equation is really important to get comfortable with because you're going to be doing it quite a lot on site when you're preparing to buy materials. So this is very different to our previous ratio equation. First, ascertain how many total parts we have in our mix. 6 gravel, 6 clay, and 4 sand. That equals 16 parts total. We then take 100 and divide it by 16, equaling 6.25. So each part in our total mix is now worth 6.25%. We chose 100 as this is what any percentage is based on. Percentage in Latin translating literally to per centum, which means 100 or by the 100, which is pretty cool. Now we take our parts and multiply them by 6.25%. So that equals 6 gravel times 6.25, 6 clay times 6.25, and 4 sand by 6.25. That equals 37.5% gravel, 37.5% clay, and 25% sand. Now we've just scraped through, or we're just actually a bit over our ideal clay percentage of 33%, which I mentioned earlier is a good thing to aim for. But to achieve our ideal mix, we can simply add 2 parts of sand, which is going to end up with 6 parts gravel, 6 parts clay, and 6 parts sand. But remember, on site, it's actually going to equal 6 parts gravel, 10 parts site soil, and 2 parts sand. Again, let's simplify this ratio down. It's a bit big by finding the largest common factor between all the parts, that being 2. Divide all of our parts by 2, and that gives us a simplified ratio of 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. We do this because we want to be measuring as little as possible on site. And as you can imagine, it's much easier to measure 5 larger buckets of something as opposed to 10 smaller buckets of something. Hey guys, that was really intense. So if you've made it this far, well done. And I just want to say the rest of this episode, it's going to be really hands-on. That was really mathy, and it's the way that I want to teach this, which is deep theoretical and technical and mathematical understanding of this technology. But then most of the learning is done on site and with your hands. So I'm going to show you all now exactly how to do this with your hands. And I hope that that makes sense, because that's ultimately what all of this work is about. It's about getting out there and actually doing it for yourself and feeling this technology, okay? So yeah, hang on in there, and we're just going to dive into the rest of the episode where it's all hands on, okay? Good luck. Now we're going to be taking this info and making real life tests so that you can be certain that your mixes are going to hold together really well and be a very successful mix before getting on site. To do this, we're going to need a large sample of your chosen and tested site soil, a similarly large amount of sand, and the same of gravel, and 1 bag of cement. These are the additives appropriate to this example based on your tests from last episode, but you may need to purchase clay also to add to your mix if your subsoil is predominantly sand or gravel. Let's talk more about sand and gravel types. Now, both will be available from either quarries or sand and soil suppliers local to you, as we purchase things commonly used in the concreting or landscaping industries. The best type of sand to purchase is a large particle coarse sand, which has no clay content, commonly called washed or clean coarse sand. Now, this may vary depending on the terms they use in your area, but just ask for the sand used in concreting. This sand must be coarse and have 0% clay in it, so that it's an easy way to start the discussion with your local sand merchant. What do you use for concreting? Equally, the more jagged and coarse your gravel, the better. So not river stones preferably, which have been smoothed on the outside after being rolled in a river over time. This isn't a complete no-no having smooth stones, but jagged rough stones are much better at locking into each other within your mix while tamping. These two materials just mentioned, coarse sand and coarse gravel, are often highly controlled and processed by the quarries, and they'll be sold as a 100% content material. In other words, there will be a consistent particle size throughout the mix as they've been sifted thoroughly before sale, and also there'll be one type of material throughout. But you can actually purchase material which is a collection of particle sizes as well, like a sand and gravel mix. Now this is sometimes a byproduct or a runoff material created from crushing larger rocks into gravel, and then the larger gravel particles, they're sifted out, and what's left is this crushed material, and it often spans between fine sands, coarse sands, and into the finer sized rocks. This is quite ideal to purchase as well as an additive, as it's basically already a great mix. It's just missing the clay content. It's often called crusher dust or crusher fines, but again, these terms are going to change, so only start by discussing the outlined creation process with the dirt merchant and go from there. Sometimes they also sell a concrete mix, which is coarse washed sand and coarse gravel in great ratios, so ask about that as well. Basically, just start the conversation. Ultimately, you want to be purchasing materials which you know exactly what's in them, so you have the most control over your mix creation. You don't want to be working on assumptions. Also, fine sands could be on offer at the soil yards or quarries, but it isn't as appropriate to build with because it doesn't lock in the same way under compression. Again, it's not a complete no-no, but it's not ideal, and that's what I really want to teach, ideal scenarios. Now the same can be said for beach sand. Maybe you live in a real sandy, beachy area, and beach sand is actually really bad because it's been rolled by the ocean, and they're actually tiny little balls, like tiny little ball bearings, so they don't lock into each other at all. Fine sands are good for plasters and getting a nice smooth finish, but they don't work great inside your bags. So, we're looking at a very specific subsoil in this example, but you must be making educated guesses on sample mixes to make which make sense for your type of subsoil and what that subsoil is going to need for amendments to get it closer to that 1:1:1 mixture. If you have a clay heavy mix, you're going to need to add sand or gravel, and if you have a sand heavy mix, you're going to need to add clay or a stabilizer. We've been deep in the numbers this last little bit, but as a really good summary of all this, what you need is a ratio of structure, which comes from sand and gravel, and glue, which comes from clay or stabilizer. And it's good to aim for 70 to 80% structure and 20 to 30% glue. I hope this helps simplify and clarify things at this kind of complex stage. Now, the point of this next step is to test a few different sample ratios so that we find where the perfect mix exists, and also so that we can see what poor samples look and feel like, so that you get a really good understanding of what we're not looking for as well as what we're looking for. So I'll use the same ratio as we settled on in the last example, which is 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. So let's start here and make sure that our calculations are actually good in real life. Now we're going to be using small plastic cups to compress our final mixes into and let them set up and dry completely. We will then analyze them once they're dry. Alright, here we are at our mixing station, and I'm just going to run over some ground rules. Now the best thing about using ratios is that the ratio, it stays the same, but the part or the measuring container that we're going to be used to make a part, it can be any size at all, big or small, and the relationship of all the parts stays exactly the same. It could be a thimble or a bathtub, it doesn't matter at all, and that's the absolute joy and simplicity of working with ratios when on site or when we're practicing here. So the point of this test is to confirm that our mix ratio is going to be strong and water resistant over time. Now, given our exhaustive theoretical planning from the first half of this episode, I'm going to say that this is going to make a rock solid end result just from experience. You're welcome to experiment at this stage, and you really are encouraged to do as many mixes as possible so that you can see for yourself what's going to work, and just as importantly, what's going to fail for your particular site soil. Ultimately, the goal is to use as little bought material as possible and as much of your site soil as you can. On many jobs that I've worked on, where we were able to use 100% site soil in our bags, it really just depends on your specific region and your specific site. I'm also going to be doing at the end, as a separate unrelated test, just to show you guys, I'm going to run through 9 different tests starting at 10% clay, which as a ratio equals 9 sand, 1 clay. I'm going to be doing that, and they're going to incrementally increase by 10% each time. So this is 10% clay, that'll be 20%, 30%, 40%, and all the way up to 90% clay. And I'm going to show you guys how that reacts differently, both as a mix, as a wet mix, and then how it ends up drying and how it actually performs, just so that you can see a really systematic, widespread of what your site soil may look like. You might have 10% clay, you might have less than 10% clay, or you might have 70 or 80% clay. So I just want to give everyone a really good wide example of what might be out there in the world and what you might be coming up against. So here on the table we have gravel, which is just 100% dry gravel. Pretty basic, lots of different sizes in there. There's definitely some smaller ones going all the way up to like a bit more than 1/4 of an inch or 5 mil or so. So getting quite large and all the way down to quite small, which is a great thing to work with. 100% dry and washed sand. So it's just pure coarse sand. Over here we have our site soil, which, as we found out and as we've been chatting about the whole episode, is around 60% clay and 40% coarse sand. So just like our last episode where we checked out all of our tests with our hands first, that's what we're going to do. So I'm going to look at it. It's got heaps of that flour that I was talking about from last episode. Like, majority is flour. Really fine. And there's definitely some large chunks in there, which is the coarse sand. But so much of it, you can see, is getting stuck on my fingers, stuck on the rest of my hand, and you can just see that I can't see the particle sizes. So that definitely tells us that there's a really large amount of clay. And confirmed by our jar test, there definitely is 60% clay, 40% sand. So this is all site soil. And then over here we have 100% dry clay. There's tiny little balls in there, but they can be broken up with my finger, and absolutely everything turns into lovely floury powder. Now, although our measuring device can be absolutely anything, it could be this, it could be this, which is what I'm going to end up using, which is a tablespoon. Just because this is a tablespoon measurer, I don't want anyone to think that ratios have anything to do with preset volumes like a cake recipe does. This has nothing to do with the fact that it's a tablespoon measurer. I just found this in my kitchen drawer and it just worked out to be a really good size. The reason it's a good size is because based on the amount of our ratios that we're going to be making and putting into a cup, we're deliberately not going to completely fill these cups. We normally aim to about half fill or 3/4 fill these cups. This is just a really good size because I know how many of all of these different parts I have to get into this cup eventually. So this is just a nice size to not have too much wasted material at the end, and also not enough. So it could equally just be a big mug, you know, you could do literally anything. Like I said before, could be a thimble or a bathtub, and the ratio stays exactly the same. So my one single part will be one of these scoops. I'm not even going to call it a tablespoon, I'm just going to call it a scoop, because that's what it is. Now to talk about the cups, I've just got these nice little party cups, and I've already written out my recipe, or my ratio, sorry, on the cups. So we got 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand, and I've labeled it mix number 1. I've also written it on the back of an old Greek yogurt tub that I've cut up, which is plastic, which is important because we're going to put some of these samples in water, and we have to take them out of the cups and put them in, completely submerge them in water. So we need to make sure that we've got something that's waterproof, that we're going to be able to tell which sample is which still. So that's what I'm going to do. We're going to fill this, and then I'm going to plonk that in the middle of the sample, and we're going to give it a bash and get it in there. So that's really, really good to do, so that you're just really clear before you start. You make all of your practice mixes. You could make as many recipes as you want, write them on as many cups as you want, and then just get really prepared. Pre-write this, pre-write your cup, and you're ready to go. Based on our written ratio, we need 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. So I'm going to start with 3 gravel. 1, 2, 3. 5 site soil. And 1 sand. Cool. I'm going to give that a mix. It's really good to dry mix these first, just like a cake. A little bit of organics in there, get that out. So for the first time, I'm going to talk about moisture, which is just adding water. So adding water to your mix is a super important part of this whole process. You normally do it in the cement mixer or in the wheelbarrow, or sometimes you can bulk wet an entire pile the night before and it will soak in really well, but probably most commonly you're going to be either doing it in a cement mixer or in a wheelbarrow. So we're ultimately practicing to do that, and the water is the only part that isn't measured as an actual part. On site, you do get a certain feel, and you can sometimes write approximately how much water you need to put in, but quite often it's just done visually and by eye and also by hand. So this is when you're first tuning your skills to be able to do something like that by hand. So the way that this works, I've just popped a tiny little hole in the top there, and that lets me just drip the water out because it's really easy to over wet at this point. And what we're actually looking for is the mix to be able to hold together. I'm going to grab it, squeeze it in my hand, throw it up in the air 3 times or more, and to be able to hold together and not break apart for those 3 times. So if I pick this up now, got a good handful, give it a really good squeeze. That's just completely powder still. So if I try to throw that in the air, it's just going to completely fall apart immediately. So that's not what we want. What we want to be doing is adding a little bit of moisture and mixing, pretending like it's just in the cement mixer, and it's just going to be mixing like this, and giving it a really thorough mix. Just dripping it on there. You don't ever want to get too much at any one time. Just a couple more. You don't want to be able to see any dry pockets anywhere. There we go. Now, if I grab that, squeeze it together as hard as I can. 1, 2, 3. I could go all day with that, I reckon. See there? It doesn't look terribly appetizing, does it? You can see that that's incredibly well binded together, or bound, if you will. And it does come apart for sure. But the thing we're looking for as well is, when you squeeze this together, it doesn't leave a pool of water on my hand. It actually leaves no residual water or that mud water. Remember how we were painting in the last episode with the really clay-rich samples? So it's leaving no water there, and it's also not glistening on the surface at all. There's no shine to it, there's no glisten, but it can hold together 3 times when you throw it in the air. It's holding together ridiculously well, as you can see. So this is looking like a really, really, really good sample. Give it a really good final mix, get everything down the bottom. Again, there's no residual water on my hand, there's no pooling. That water just came from the water bottle. There's no water on my hand, there's no pooling, but it's sticking together incredibly successfully. Now we're going to start putting it in there, and then I'm going to give it a tamp. I'm going to give it a tamp like we're on site. Just light tamps. On site you will go absolutely mental with the tamp. So it's really, really, really well compressed. Cool. There we go. We've got our tab nicely implanted in there, so that again, when we do the water test at the end, where we're going to completely submerge these, we're going to see how they all hold up. I'm going to give it just a little bit of a helping hand around the edges. There we go. That's mix number 1. 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. Bing bang bosh. 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. Yeah. Now this one is the same mix as mix number 1, but we're just going to add half a part of cement. So 0.5 of a part of cement, 3 gravel, 5 site soil, 1 sand. The reason that we're going to do this, I'll do the maths quickly on screen. First, we find our total amounts of parts within our mix, which is 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand, equaling 9 parts total. We then take 100 and divide it by this 9, equaling 11.11%. So each part is now worth 11.11%. If we halve one of those parts, as we're about to do, we get 5.5%. which is our approximate admix amount of cement we are adding to mix 2. And 1/4 of a part is 2.75% admix amount of cement, which we'll be adding to mix number 3. And that's how we decided to add half a part of cement, because we want to be adding as little cement as possible, because it's both an added cost, but it's also terrible for the planet. So we really want to be using as little as possible, but really, realistically, the tiny percentage that we need is such a small amount compared to the overall mass and volume of the entire dome and the entire mix. So realistically, you end up using a very small amount, but this is 0.5 of a part. Now, not to get too lost, again, this is where this part as an actual measuring spoon isn't fantastic, because it's going to be quite hard to guess that as half a part, so half a tablespoon, because of its round bottom. If it was something like this, which I didn't want to use because it would end up being way too big of a mix and would just waste a lot, but something like this is actually way easier because you can much easier see halfway up this than you can halfway up this. But I have a lovely saying, and it's called close enough for natural building. And so this is just going to be where we get a little bit more relaxed, a little bit less mathy, and all I have to do is estimate half of a part of this spoon. So that's going to be pretty easy. So we're going to make the mix exactly the same, and then right at the end, just going to put in that extra part of the cement, which we have up over there in our bag. So same as before, 3 gravel, 5 site soil, 1 sand. Three gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. Again, I'm going to dry mix all of this stuff in first. And once again, I've got my little thing. And now half a spoonful of cement. Lol, I actually went sideways. That's half a spoonful. I reckon that looks pretty good to me. When you're mixing on site, you are ultimately, sometimes you're using parts like buckets, but very often you're using parts like shovels. So an estimate like this actually ends up being pretty accurate to what you'll end up doing on site, but you definitely want to be as accurate as you can in this early testing stage. Definitely important to dry mix this, and a lot of this stuff actually mirrors what happens on site as well. It's always best, and you really should always start with dry mixing all your materials first in your cement mixer or in your barrow, and then adding the water. That is really what you end up doing on site. So we really are trying to mimic what happens on site as much as possible. So once again, this is a dead dry mix. There's no moisture in this, and there's no way that that's going to hold together at all. So we're going to start adding our water just like before, and something very special is happening now. The reason that we add cement is because we want to introduce a permanent chemical change to what's going on in here, and that permanent chemical change begins when we add water. The water reacts with the dry cement and starts a chemical reaction where it will permanently change its structure and permanently bond to everything around it. So that's the major difference between using clay as a binder and using cement as a binder. So that's looking pretty good for moisture. Again, the only real test is the squish test. Give it a good squeeze, and then 1, 2, 3. It's holding together pretty well. I reckon we can do just the tiniest bit more moisture. That's why this dripper is so good, because it's so difficult to get it done any other way. Again, this would be rolling around in the cement mixer, doing its thing. And now, no water left on my hand, no water glistening on the surface. 1, 2, 3. It's holding together incredibly well. Same as before. We'll half rough one first. Again, we've got our little tab, 0.5 cement, 3 gravel, 5 site soil, 1 sand. There we go, mix number 2, all done. Now mix number 3 is exactly the same, but it's even less cement. So the last one was 0.5 or 0.50, and this is 0.25, which is 1/4 of a part. So we've got 1/4 of a part here, and we had 1/2 of a part in the last one. So exactly the same, 3 gravel, 5 site soil, 1 sand, but we're just reducing the amount of cement in it, just so that, again, so that we can really hope to use as little cement as possible, but it still hold together really well. So yeah, let's get into it. Five site soil. Just like when you're baking, it's really good to be as level as you can and as precise as we can in these early stages, because if we get this wrong at this early stage, it's only going to extrapolate out and be more incorrect when we get on site. So that's 5 and 1 sand. Again, thorough mix first, then I'm going to add the cement. Really is amazing what just that tiny amount of cement will do to our dry samples. Once again, nice estimate on 1/4 of one of these. I reckon that looks really good. Looking good, still powdery, just like the last one. Got to add some water. You really want to avoid wet spots. You want everything to be mixed really evenly, just like when you're baking a cake. Same thing, that's looking really good. It's looking really nice and moist. Just get a big handful, really cram it together. 1, 2, 3. Look at that. No glisten. No pull on my hand. Really good. Just as a tiny example, this is what too wet would look like. Getting shine on those rocks there. Getting shine and glisten on those rocks. And a little bit of a pool there. Let's make it a bit more extreme. Shiny palm there. Shiny palm, you'd get nice wet, nice brown smudge there. And then glisten on the surface, just starting to shine. That's what we don't want, but now I can easily just integrate that into the rest of the mix and it'll be fine. Counterintuitively, you actually want a jelly bag for some very specific purposes, which we'll go into in bag laying, but you do actually want a jelly bag sometimes, mainly for going, well, only for going over openings. We'll get into that in bag laying, but it's good to start honing your hands and your eyes into what's too wet and what's too dry. Too dry would have been, all of those would have fallen apart when I threw them in the air. Mix number 3. Now, equally, we're going to do a bit of a interesting one where we're just going to do one of complete site soil. That's going to be mix number 4. And I'm going to show you why we couldn't just stay with the around 60% clay and 40% sand in our bags. As you could see, I could really easily pick up and mold all those other mixes. That really nice mix that we've deliberately made to try and be the best mix possible. I could use that easily in my hands. It would wet easily and thoroughly, and then it wouldn't stick to the spoon, it wouldn't stick to the bowl, and it's just easy to work with. I'm going to preempt and say that doing this mix is going to be ridiculously sticky, and that's when it becomes impractical to be able to try and fill a bag with a mix that sticky, and also really impractical to try and work it in a cement mixer because it just sticks to the side of your cement mixer and you just can't hydrate it properly. You can't hydrate it thoroughly. It wants to clump. It wants to just be an absolute muddy mess. So, one site soil. Going to do about that much. That'll be 1 part for this one. 1 part is going to be our cup. So just all site soil. Here we go. Already so much harder to mix because it's sticking together just like peanut butter. And also, because the clay particles are so fine, you can compress clay so much harder, and it doesn't want to lock in as quickly and effectively as sand does. Just wants to keep on compressing basically because it's so fine. And that's ultimately not what we want as well when we're tamping a bag. We don't want it to just be forever compressing. It's super easy to over wet this mix, and in saying that, I'm almost too wet with this because it's just so bloody sticky. It's literally exactly like peanut butter. And yes, it's going to stick together. It's going to stick together ridiculously well, but it's soft like pottery is. It's soft like potter's clay. And that means that when we tamp it and compress it into a bag, it'll want to stay floppy and mushy like this. And you'll ultimately be able to just kind of remove the bags, especially over an opening. Like, you'll be able to just splooge them around. You'll be able to stick your thumb into it like that. And this sticks like absolute crazy. I can hold that upside down and this would just get stuck to every corner and crevice of your cement mixer. So yes, it's annoying when it's mixing, but then secondarily, if you're trying to use this in your bags, you're going to end up making a really inconsistent row. So it's going to be high in some spots, low in other spots, coming in and out all really erratically because you're not able to fill this properly. Like imagine trying to get a bucket into a wheelbarrow full of this stuff, get it relatively well full, and then throw it up onto the dome, get it out of the bucket into the bag, and then get it to slide easily and evenly down the bag, and then tamp it right at the end. All of those stages would be almost impossible with this mix because it's just so sticky. It's literally close to potter's clay. So misleadingly, this mix is actually going to dry and come out of here really well. It's going to stick together incredibly well. It'll be like a piece of air-dried pottery. So misleadingly, if we didn't know anything else about the future of how we want to use this mix, we would potentially say, when we pull this out of the cup, that this is actually a great mix because it's held together incredibly well and it'll literally set like a piece of air-dried pottery. So that'll be quite misleading. That's why we need to be really aware of the end method and purpose that we need for this mix. One of the most important aspects of that is for it to mix well and easily and thoroughly in the mixer. So yeah, really, really good to be aware of that. So we've got mix 1, 2, 3 and mix number 4 all drying now. And now I said that I'm also going to do, as a totally separate thing with no cement involved, I'm going to do 10% clay, which is 1 part clay, 9 parts sand. I'm going to do that one in this one. And then 20%, which is 2 parts clay and 8 parts sand. And so on, all the way up to 90% clay and 1 part sand. I'm going to just do that quite quickly. I'm just going to move through it quite quickly, get them all into here, and then the main thing, the main reason that I want to be doing this is to be showing you when they're dry how different they all are and how they slowly incrementally change. So I'm just going to smash that out without much explanation, and then we're going to talk about it a lot once they're dry. And again, I got pure clay here and pure sand here. So I'm going to get my side soil out of the way so I don't confuse myself. We've got sand and clay. Now where we're using this as 1 part, I'm going to actually come down to this smaller one as a part, just so that I don't use as much sand. And it really doesn't matter if if it just ends up being a small amount of this cup. I'm just going to be using this as an example. So 1 clay, 9 sand. This mix is already performing so differently than the other ones. It really doesn't want to hold together at all, but the joy is always in when it gets wet. That's when it really changes. It's going to be great. They're going to be these little pucks at the bottom of these caps. I'm going to pull them out when they're all nice and dry. 20%, 8 sand, 2 clay. As I mentioned before, this mix, 20% clay and 80% sand, it's actually one of my favorite mixes that I've used as an unstabilized vertical wall building. So it wasn't as a dome, which dome's in, and it was just a vertical wall building. So I was really, really happy with this mix if you're going just straight up. 30%, 7 sand, 3 clay. So we're really hitting that ideal ratio of around 30% clay. %, 6 sand, 4 clay. Now it's starting to get into that way too clumpy territory that we got to before. Sticking to everything. Really starting to get unmanageable once we start getting past that 30% clay, and that's really good to recognize. Again, it's going to stick together well like a piece of pottery will, but it also sticks to absolutely everything else around it. Super sticky. It's literally like peanut butter stuck to my fingers now. So you can imagine working with this on site would just be an absolute nightmare, because you have to get it to a certain point of hydration, otherwise everything doesn't bind together. So you must be adding the water. So you can't be working with a dry mix, which is what this starts off at. You can't start this as a dry mix and get it in the bags, which it would get in the bags, but it wouldn't stick to itself because it's just a dry powder. It's literally just like baker's flour. So that wouldn't work as well. Look at that. The first hit and it just stuck to the bottom of the hammer. I can't even get this. Can't even get this to tamp very well because it's just sticking to everything. So that's just at 40% clay. 40% clay, it's almost unmanageable even for me on this little micro level. It's almost impossible to do. Again, it's just soft, doughy clay. You just could not work with that. Absolutely could not work with that. I reckon I've just proved a point to myself. Instead of going through all of these, I'm just going to do this last one, which is 5 sand, 5 clay, which is 50-50 or 1-to-1 as a ratio. And just from the way that that last one performed, I'm going to totally can these, because these are, I know they're going to be totally ridiculously hard to work with. So I'm not even going to bother. But I hope that that illustrates a point enough for you that anything approaching or over 50% clay is totally unmanageable to work with. Check this out. Exactly the same, just so sticky, so hard to manage. There we go, 50% clay, 5 sand, 5 clay. Ew. So that's it, guys. That is the tests that I wanted to get done. As I said, fuck doing these. They would have been so painful to work with. So they're gone. We're gonna have 4 mixes over here with a little bit more cement in the 2. And then we've got our incremental increasing ones just to show you guys what's going on. So yeah, that's a really good opportunity to get nice and muddy. I would love to see people trying out and making 10 variations of different mixes, different gravels, different sands, different site soils, and really honing in on what is going to be the best for your exact site. So next step is to let all of these dry. You can put them on a windowsill. You can put them in a warm oven, nowhere above like 50 degrees Celsius. A warm oven just overnight, like an oven that's cooling down. You could just pop it in there if you want to do it quickly, but just on a nice sunny windowsill is the best. Leave it there for about a week or two, let them totally dry out to their core, and then we're going to have a look at them. So I'm really excited. Thanks for hanging in there, guys. Let's get into it. You. All right, welcome back everybody. We've got all of our mixes over here and then all of our practice mixes over here. So the only thing I've done off camera, I've actually doubled each of these mixes. So it's still just 4 ratio recipes, but I've just doubled them so that I can put one of them underwater and do some other tests with the back ones. So just right now, we're just going to be playing with the water and we're going to be having a bit of a look at it as well. So I've had them on the windowsill for about 3 weeks actually, and they're super dry. And it's good to not put them in direct sunlight because the direct sunlight can actually dry them out too fast and then it'll give you an incorrect read. So yeah, we're just going to do some initial visual inspections with these, pop them in the water, and then we're going to look at all of these. So here we go. So coming up first is mix number 1, which is 3 gravel, 5 site soil, and 1 sand. This is our golden, amazing mix that I'm pretty confident we're going to be able to build with as an unstabilized mix as well. But I'm just gonna show you with the water a bit later about what happens to it. But first of all, we're just going to have a look here. There's a tiny bit of loose material, but that's just because of bad packing. So this is all looking really good. From the outside, it's feeling incredibly solid and everything's looking good. It's got its tab in it so that it can go underwater and not get too, we're not going to get too disoriented with it. But yeah, one thing to look at these is the shrink rate around the edges. Is there major shrinkage? Does the material pull back from the edge of the cup? And this doesn't very much, which is good, which is what you want. We don't want shrinkage inside the bags, and the shrinkage comes from the clay content absorbing the water, and then during evaporation while it's drying, it lets that water go. So water has the capacity to hold a lot of volume. So even though we're only adding a small amount, it's still a solid amount of volume that we're adding to our mixes. And if that dries out and leaves too fast or in the wrong manner and leaves the wrong residual materials behind, then that can actually be really detrimental to our mixes, especially over arches and over window and door openings. Can be really detrimental. So that is something that we're looking for in this really early stage. The first thing is it pulling away from the edge of the cup? And this one is not. I'll give a bit of an example as to what might be pulling away. So you can see here, we are pulling away quite a bit there and there. So that means that this material originally had quite a bit of volume, and that volume was being held by the clay content. So this shrinkage always is directly related to the clay content. The higher the clay content, the higher the shrink rate is going to be when it dries out. So that's the first thing to look for. This one looking really good, looking really nice. I'm going to pull it out of its little house. I think I'm going to have to tear it. Here we go. Mix number 1, it's looking really good. It's looking like it's holding together. I'm pushing that real hard. Oh, there we go. We got a bit of breakage. There we go. A little bit of breakage first off, which is telling us that obviously it can be pulled apart. I'd also say that that was a bit of a failure point because of the way I packed these. So I packed it there first, packed it all down, came with a second one, packed it secondarily. So there you go. That's something to note, that we have been able to pull it apart. And now I'm going to get it and I'm going to place it in the water and we're going to leave it there overnight. Already, that is just collapsing. It looks super cool. Wow. It's just completely disintegrating immediately. So that just shows that clay is always going to be susceptible to reabsorption of water. The only time it isn't is when you either alter its structure with the use of firing it in a kiln that permanently changes its structure, or you add something else which wants to permanently change its own structure, which is the cement. So that is an amazing example. I'm very surprised at that. I knew that it was going to go, but I really didn't know it was going to go that quick. Wow. It has totally gone. The tab's just there. So I'm just going to leave that there for the lols. That was mix number 1 with no stabilizer in it. So you can see how useful stabilizer might be in the future. So mix number 2, we have half a part of cement and then everything else is exactly the same. So this is our more rich version with the cement, which is our stabilizer. So we got half a part of cement in total. So it's looking good, same thing. It's not pulling away from the edges, which is good. Looking nice and stable. Wow. This one actually sounds like a rock. I'm not going to stress test these ones too much because really the main point of this bit is the water test. That's why I made a secondary one, so that we can stress test all those secondary ones. So now it's firmly in there. I'm going to pop this one. It's looking really, really good. Literally sounds like an actual rock. So let's see what happens now. Seems to be behaving very differently. It's absorbing water because cement, and there's also a lot of clay in there, cement and clay can still absorb water like brickwork in your house or a pavement or the slab of a foundation. They're still going to wick water up them and they're still going to absorb water. But does that mean if it takes on some moisture, or a lot of moisture in this instance, is it going to lose its mechanical bond to itself and to the particles around it? That's really what we're testing here. If this stuff gets wet again, is it going to mechanically fail? And currently, this hasn't, which is very cool. And mix number 3, 0.25, which is a quarter of a part of cement, which is half as much as that, and 3 gravel, 5 site soil, 1 sand. So always using the same 3 gravel, 5 site soil, 1 sand. We're just adding more cement or less cement to it. Mix number 1 is looking completely gone. And now we're going to see how this one goes. Again, really low shrinkage rate. So all of them have had the same minimal shrinkage rate, which is great. That's really, really important. Definitely looking a bit more powdery than the last one. Seems to want, just under my fingers and my hands, seems to want to come apart just a little bit differently than mix number 2. So that's to be expected. It's got half as much cement in this, so you're going to expect that it's not going to hold together as well as the other one. But let's see if this percentage of cement is beneficial and helpful to us. And then here, mix number 4, just for interest, we've just got 100% site soil, and we're going to pop that in there as well and see what happens. But based off our last test that had no stabilizer, I'm going to assume this isn't going to hold up very well. But like I said, on first inspection, look how much more that's pulled away than all of the other mixes. So you can imagine if those hairline cracks were happening all the way throughout your bags, that is a massive, massive structural issue. So when Nada went back to Iran and studied the mud brick buildings, he found out that the mud brick mortars, which are the lines in between all your bricks, the bits that actually stick them together, when there's the tiniest movement from settling of the foundation or an earthquake and the building twists or moves in any way, those mortar lines were the first things that would shatter, and then as soon as that would shatter, the bricks would lose their mechanical bond to each other. So you can imagine a similar thing happening inside our bags, that if there's the tiniest bit of movement, especially above openings, then these big fissures come up and they go all the way throughout the bags. And this will happen without any movement or settling of the bags. This will happen just with evaporation and drying. It does happen very slowly in the bags, which is to our advantage, and makes it a little bit safer how slowly the bags will actually dry out. But it's still definitely something to think about and look at. So there we go. One site soil and some water. That's all we are. I forgot to put this in, so I'm just going to place it with it. You can really see here, that definitely would have been one of those compaction issues as well. But you can also see that this has really wanted to pull away from itself much, much more than all the other mixes, mainly because it just doesn't have the stability of our main mix. That's why we've put so much effort into making a really, really good mix. That's why all those calculations are worth it, because you can just see here that if you had cracks like this all the way throughout your bags, that would be absolutely disastrous for your building. So I'm really, really happy with how clearly this is defining what we're trying to do here. In we go. So now we're going to leave these here for 24 hours. I'm going to come back in the morning and we're going to have a nice inspection of them. And then we're going to do some structural tests with all the rest of these ones. So again, these are my duplicates of what we just put in there. And all these ones we're just going to have a bit of a look at and a bit of a play with as well. See you in the morning. So here we are, 24 hours later, ta-da, and we've had these soaking and the water's settled a bit, which is good. And on first inspection, both of these are still looking like they're holding together. Our two ones with just our site soil, one site soil, and our unstabilized mix, they are completely disintegrated. They've turned into just a pile of stuff in the water. But these two are holding together really, really well still. So let's have a look at them. So this is our 0.25 of a part of cement. So this is, so it's still holding, whoa, spoke too soon. It's still holding together pretty well. Yes, I can pull some bits apart, but the large majority of it, it is still holding together. So that's really, really good. There we go. I did it. I made it. So, massive explosion there. So yeah. 24 hours in water, it was still holding together, which is good, but I could pull it apart eventually. So I'm going to pop all of them in there. So there we go. Does hold together underwater, does still hold its form and hold itself together, but I can pull it apart eventually. Let's check out the next one, which is half a part of cement. Oh. This one is still looking really, really solid. So pull some of the edges apart. You can get some of this loose material off. So that's just a symptom of the packing technique, I think. If you imagine this being inside a bag, it's going to be tamped in quite a different way than how we did it. So we started off here, did a little fill, tamped it, little fill, tamped it, little fill, tamped it. So it's kind of done in 3 different tamps. But within the bag, it's completely compressed all together. So it's going to be a lot more uniform, and the mass is going to be much larger inside the bag as well. But I'm incredibly happy with this. I can't pull this apart yet. Here we go. Fuck. That was way harder to do. So, yep. So I can get it apart eventually, but that's much harder to do. So yeah, that one's held together so much better than the first one. And basically, what I was taught at CalEarth was if these can hold their own shape underwater, then that means that they're good enough to go in the bags. And both of these definitely held their shape underwater. Yeah, it's just with some pushing and pulling and twisting, I could pull them both apart, but it was still really difficult. As you could see, completely different than the first 2 tests. So this is still a massive success, even though I got both of these apart eventually. The one with 0.25 of a part of cement, that was definitely way easier to get apart than the one with twice as much cement, which you'd expect. So yeah, I'm still really, really happy with these tests. And again, at CalEarth we were taught if it can hold its own shape underwater, which both of these did incredibly well, and resist the penetration of water to fail their structure, then they're good enough to go in the bag. That's all good. All right, so next we're gonna just look at our little mini tests that we did. 10% clay, 20% clay, 30%, 40%, 50%. And these ones, as I said, they're a bit of a different test than the water test and the other mixes, because I just kind of wanted them as a little bit of an indicator as to how the mix will perform, and mainly how the mix will perform in the cement mixer or while you're making the mix. So before, when I was mixing them, I stopped at 50% because I knew that anything greater than 50% is going to be basically unworkable in the mix. So that was the first point that I wanted to make, that there's just going to be way too much clay in anything approaching 50% in a mix. So that was the first point that I wanted to make. Way too sticky and way too hard to work in a mixer or in a barrow. And then the second point, I just want to visually inspect them all and show you guys what's going on. So first of all, we'll look at the 50%, and you can see really clearly here around the edges, that's really where the main telltale signs of shrinkage comes from. It's around the edges of these cups, and that's really substantially pulled away. They're gaps of about 1 millimeter, and that, again, if you imagine veins of these cracks going throughout your whole material in your bags, that's going to be really, really not what you want inside your bags. It's going to introduce structural issues and structural failure of the actual material in the bags, not to mention how difficult it's going to be to mix this mix. So that's the 50% mix, and way too much shrinkage. We got a 40%, still got a lot of shrinkage around here. So still got a lot around the perimeter, and yeah, it's still in my mind unacceptable. You're going to have a lot of those veins and cracks running through your bags. And 30%, which is where we're at with our ideal mix, there's almost none. There's a little shadow of shrinkage there and a little shadow of shrinkage there, but that's it. Everything else is really well held together. I'm going to pull all of these apart and actually look at them. And so we're going to inspect this a bit better, but this is where the mix starts getting really usable and really good. So we're maximizing the glue content so that this sticks together really, really coherently and really, really well, but we're minimizing the shrinkage. So 40% is too much. Just when we hit this 30% area is when we get in that real sweet spot. So very happy with this, and this is really, really good. Down to 20% clay. Again, this is still really, really usable. We're still in the zone where this is still a great unstabilized mix. Nothing wrong with 20%. There's no shrinkage. It's actually going to mix potentially even better than the 30% because it's going to be less sticky, but it's still got a great amount of glue in there to stick everything together. So I actually really like working with around 20% clay. Like I said before, we worked with 20% clay, 80% coarse sand, which is exactly what this mix is, and it worked really, really well. And then all the way down to 10. So you can see that we are getting quite a bit more sandy here, but 10% is still a pretty good mix to work with. It's definitely still acceptable in my mind, and basically for me, anything from 10% to 30% clay is still acceptable. Anything below 10% clay and you really start risking, especially as an early builder, you really start risking some of the structural elements of your dome, but I'm still happy working with 10% clay. I definitely prefer 20 to 30%. I definitely would encourage that in any scenario. It's always better to go up, but this is still manageable at a pinch. So now I'm going to pull them all apart and line them all up here, and then we're just going to look at they're just going to be little pucks. We're going to look at them separately. So here's mix number 1. You can see that there's a lot of micro fissures and micro kind of gaps in here. The seal up against the edge of the cup isn't nearly as clean as some of the other ones that I'll show you. So there's lots and lots of micro kind of spaces already that basically will just want to turn into cracks at any sign of movement. So when I was in Adelaide working on my very first dome workshop that I went to with Jeremy Millington, shout out Jezza, he said the reason that we have this even amount and good mix of things is that physically they fill the spaces really well. So the clay particle is very, very small and can fit into all of the micro areas that the coarse sand and fine sands can't fit into. So you want your mix to be a uniform mix. So you want everything to be one body. So that's why we have an even amount of gravel, sand, and clay, because we need them all to be working in an even amount. And you can see here that all of these little pit holes and things, they go all the way throughout the mix. So they're going to want to just open up very quickly at the slightest amount of pressure or twisting or torsion or whatever the building is put under. whether it's from settling or seismic activity or a car driving into it, they're just going to want to open up much quicker. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of a go and try and just gently pop it open. Oh. It's actually harder than I thought, which is good. There we go. So you can see definitely see that those micro fissures go all the way throughout the bags. So we really want it to be as homogeneous as possible, as consistent as possible. So again, that was quite hard for me to twist and break open. And when it's inside the bag and it's such a large form and it's held and supported by the curve of the laid bag as well, curves make things inherently a lot stronger. Even a mix like this would actually work relatively well, really quite well. Like I said, we had less than 5% clay at CalEarth on our apprenticeship dome, and that stood up fine. There's no real issues with working with 10%. I just want to give these all as examples and show you what's going on inside your bags. So yeah, happy with that, really happy with that test, but let's see how the others perform. So 20%, you can really see here that we're getting a much finer print, if you will, of the cup. You know, we're even getting that fine edge. That's telling us that the clay particles, they're so fine that they're pushing up against the edges and they're making this really clean, almost like pottery, cast of the cup. So that's really amazing. Imagine if that was inside your bags. Your entire bag was built from that. So it's much less sandy, much less. There's very few fissures in it already, like spaces within the coarse sand. So it's already basically a wonderful uniform mass. That's really what we want inside our bags. So I'll try and give it a bit of a go. Oh, that was much harder than that first one. So I got it, but there you can really see it's so different from the one before. There's really very few air pockets in there, very few initial cracks. Cool, super happy with that. And this is much closer to our glory mix. This is the 30%. So we've got 33% clay in our main mixes over there. So this is 30%. This is really where it starts getting pretty bloody amazing. Again, real clarity of the mold, even more clarity there. It's getting really fine and precise. It's almost like a plaster cast. So amazing. Really solid. Gonna try and pull this apart. Oh fuck. Actually can't pull that apart. Oh. There we go. That was much harder than the original two. So there are no air pockets in there. There are no air pockets at all, and beginnings of cracks. Totally awesome. Really good. Again, to reiterate, this is where that 30% mark, this really is the glory zone, because anything higher than this becomes unworkable, and then you actually also have too much fine material. If we're looking at this, you actually have too much clay, which, because the particles are so fine, it becomes more brittle. So you've got too much glue. So those really fine clay particles, the real strength is where clay grabs on and holds on to the sand. That relationship is really important. it's not 100% clay that you want. You don't want 100% glue. You need that sand and that gravel in there because the clay grabs on and helps hold those to each other. That's how you achieve good structural elements in this scenario, not from large amounts of clay, because that's lots of very tiny particles, and those want to be brittle and those want to shatter as well. So that's when we step up into this zone where we're actually getting too much clay. So this is still a pretty good cast, very, very fine edge there. Still a good cast, getting closer to pottery, but I reckon I'm going to be able to pull this apart easier than the one before, which is weird. Yep, there we go. It just came apart definitely a lot easier than the 30%, and that's because we're getting into that zone where we have too much glue in there now and it's actually becoming brittle. And again, 50% clay, really nice clean edge. Actually feels powdery because some of that high clay, some of that powder comes off the surface. You know, this is almost looking like a plaster cast. So much clay in there. But again, I reckon I'm going to be able to pull it apart quite easily. Yep. That one came apart basically as easily as the 40%. Still good, there's still no open spaces in there, but we're really starting to see the detrimental effects of too much clay, which is it'll become brittle and it'll also stick to our mixer real bad and to our buckets and just make everything muddy and disastrous to work with. So yeah, that was basically a really perfect test. I'm super happy with that. It really showed the span really clearly, how it slowly changes and how that middle zone, that 30%, really is the glory zone. So to summarize, I'm super happy building with 20 to 30% clay. This is where it's good. This is where you start losing some structural strength, and I would definitely suggest if you have around 10% clay to be adding stabilizer. 100%. Again, if you're an early builder, just put stabilizer in. If you can afford it, just do it. There's no reason that you should not be putting cement in. Cement's just a wonderful equalizer, as Nada said from Cal Earth. Cement is a great equalizer of a very large span of poor types of subsoil. If you just put a little bit of cement in, it makes everything really, really good and really usable. So yep, 10% is still fine if you add a pinch and you've got to work with it, but really that 20 to 30% zone is really where it's at. And then up to 40 and 50%, that's where it starts becoming detrimental to have too much clay in your mix. Cool. So now I'm just left with these ones, which were my duplicates of the original mix 1, 2, 3, and 4. So they're exactly the same mix as the other ones that we just put into the water. But now I'm going to take these apart and I'm going to take them outside. I'm going to try and stand on them. And we're just going to see how that reacts and see which ones can take my weight. I weigh around 100 or so kilos, and that's going to be a little bit of a just rough test as to how much weight they can take. So this one specifically, in reference to what we've spoken about in the past, this is actually going to be testing their PSI rating, or pounds per square inch. So this area that they're running on will be a square inch area or square centimeter area, and the amount of pounds that you can get on that will be our PSI rating. Now, we're not going to do a PSI rating. I had all these dreams of making this squashing machine that actually weights, like officially weights how much pressure we're putting on them, but you guys aren't going to be doing that, so it's not really appropriate. The only thing I want to be teaching here is stuff that you can do at home. So yeah, everyone has their different approaches to this. Some people will drop their tests from around 1 meter or 3 feet and drop it onto the ground, and if they survive, then that's good. But we only have one of these, so I'm only going to stand on them and just see how they perform. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to take them outside and we're going to give them the old stand test. All right, here we are. We're outside. I've got my big boots on and we're going to give it a go. So I'm pretty excited about this. So this is mix number 1. So this is unstabilized. This is a pretty coherent looking mix. Pretty happy with it. And you can imagine if this is inside our earth bags, it's just going to be really, really solid. I'm going to take my life into my own hands. I'm going to see if I want to actually get that looking pretty stable. There we go. Here we go. I'm putting some weight on it. I'm putting a lot of weight on it. Oh man. Alright, it's all my weight. I'm going to see if I can balance right on it. Wow, that's 100% of my weight. Holy shit, that is amazing. I'm balancing completely on it. I'll put the maths on the screen. My weight in pounds, or pounds force in this scenario, is 231 pounds. The radius of the circular top surface on our sample is 1 inch. To figure out the area, we calculate pi r squared, equaling 3.1416 inches squared. We take my pounds force and divide it by the surface area, equaling approximately 73 pounds per square inch, or psi. So this, and all of our other successful boot tests, can withstand up to and above 73 psi, which is awesome. Wow, that's unreal. So that's no stabilizer whatsoever. That's really what I wanted to show from this, that you can really, really do some amazing stuff without stabilizer. That is incredibly surprising. I thought that was going to go for sure. Wow, so good. All right, so mix number 2, we've got half a part of cement. This one, I have a good inkling, is going to also withstand me standing on it. All right, here we go. Yep, no issues at all. That's 100% of my weight. I feel like a ballerina up here, and I can just feel that is incredibly stable. Yep, so that's 100% of my weight. Can feel that is just so solid and so stable in there. So that's amazing. Again, mix number 3, which has 0.25 of a part of cement. So just a quarter of a part of cement. Really lovely flat cast there. There we go. Balancing like a ballerina. Too easy. Too easy. That is crazy. Didn't even touch it. I think the way that this was packed, it's quite rough packed as well, so it still does have some of those micro fissures in it, but yeah, still stood up to the test. Now this will be interesting. I'm not really too sure what's going to happen with this one, but we'll give it a go. This was super easy to pull out because it was so well pulled away from the cup. So this is just 1 part site soil, which is 60% clay and 40% sand. Yep, 100% balanced. Easy peasy. There you go. So this one survives the pressure test, but does not survive the water test. Well, that was absolutely awesome. Now, this is the final spiel, guys, and if you've made it this far, then well done, okay? But here we go. As a summary of our mixes and how they performed, mix number one, our unstabilized kind of perfect mix, it failed at the underwater test, which is to be expected, but it survived the boot pressure test, which is awesome. Mix number 2 and 3 with around 10% and 5% cement survived both the underwater test and the boot pressure test, proving that adding just a touch of cement to our mix, it turns it into the best choice of mix for a beginner. The reason the underwater test is so important is because during your build, it's quite likely that the building will be rained on while you're building it and before the plaster goes on and it becomes waterproof. So you need it to be able to withstand a complete soaking without it losing its mechanical bond to itself. And mix number 4, that was just a little bit of fun and an additional test, which it did fail underwater, but it succeeded in the boot test and also held together very well when I was trying to smash it at the end. But as we found out from our smaller puck tests with varying amounts of clay in them, anything greater than about 40% clay will be unworkable on site and become a complete nightmare to mix in the mixer and the buckets. Now, I hope that exhausting episode has really clearly laid out why we want certain mixes in our bags and why we want to stay away from some as well. I will say though, the Earthbag community, it normally approaches the mix that goes into the bag like this. If it can get in your bags, you just put it in there. It's not normally approached as such a ridiculous mathematical exercise, but that's just the way that I was taught, and I never want any student's build to suffer from lack of information, even at this really early stage of your building careers. As always, please give us a like and a follow on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok, and visit schoolofsuperadobe.com and sign up for our newsletter so that we can just stay in direct contact with you for all of our new releases. As always, guys, peace, love, and bags, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.